Okay, we had started talking about symbolist art and we looked at a couple of the early people, but today we're going to look at this Rose Croix group run by this guy who I mentioned last time. Let's try and put him up again. One more. There we go. Tsar Peladon, this strange guy who declared himself, I'm going to turn this light down just a little bit, it bothers my eyes. This guy who declares himself some sort of leader of this semi-mystic group of artists who exhibited under this society called the Rose Croix Society, or the Salon de Rose Croix was the exhibition they organized. And I'm going to sort of speed through a little faster, skip a few things. I won't spend as much time on some of them so we can get back on pace, because I do want to get to the Victorians today. And the first person I want to look at, the point about symbolists that we talked about last time was their sort of rejection of realism, rejection of materialism. And we're going to see this in different ways, but it's very much an international movement. So I'm showing you some people from different places and seeing how they respond to it. You know, last time we looked at some of the quotations by these various critics and artists, the fact that they embraced what they called an ideist art as opposed to a realist art. They were interested in depicting internal states, ideas, as opposed to the physical world around them. And we're going to see people embracing this in a number of different ways. Another thing we talked about was their roots in literature, that it begins with symbolist poetry, and then we have artists, and later one sculptor in particular, who's attempting to find an equivalent to what's happening in poetry. And what's happening in poetry, why they embrace poetry, is that poetry by definition is vague. It's not like a specific clear narrative or story. It's often just evocative words and phrases put together to create an emotion. And that's what they're trying to do. Remember, Mallarmé said, to name a thing is to destroy a thing. They don't want to tell you a clear, straight narrative story. That's not evocative. That's not poetic. They want to suggest a mood or something vague. So I can't translate symbolist art for you. I can't tell you this means this, that means that, because these aren't simple allegories. They're internal. What they are interested in, however, are universal ideas and thoughts. Things like love and fear and jealousy and anxiety and all of these sort of general ideas that are in the human psyche. So that's what we're going to see, how different people explore that idea. Knopf is a Belgian and one of my favorite artists. I really like his work. He went to Paris in the 70s and discovered a lot of artists there, but he also discovered the art of the pre-Raphaelites, who we'll talk about when we get to the Victorians, and is very influenced by them. Here are a couple of early works by Knopf from the 80s. These were considered perverse at the time, illicit sexuality, as they said. They're very ambiguous. Study of women, a red chalk drawing, and the one on the right, my heart cries out for the past, also pencil and chalk. There is a sort of literary quality to symbolist art, especially Knopf and others. When I say that, I mean the works are sort of illustrational, and illustrational art usually refers to art that either does or seems to be illustrating a kind of story. In other words, when I think of illustration, think of a book illustration. An artist makes images that you put in a book, and he's really illustrating something that already exists in another art form. He's illustrating a novel, or he's illustrating something. So illustration means an artist is making an image, but it's not just their original image. It's an image of something that already exists. Because of that, illustration in the 20th century was always looked down on because it was illustration. It wasn't art. You know, it's not the artist expressing their emotions. It's the artist illustrating someone else's ideas. So illustrational, that that word has a sort of difficult history in art, especially in the 20th century. He began his career as a realist, and he was always tied to visual verisimilitude, or in other words, visual accuracy. So while these are visually very accurate, they're not realism. This isn't something in the world that he's seen. These are imaginary. He's invented these images. So he's committed to details. Just because someone makes an image that is naturalistically accurate doesn't mean it's realism. And a good example of that is somebody like, say, Salvador Dali, the surrealist. His images, as we will see in the spring, are very accurate and natural and detailed. But what he's depicting is some strange image. It's nothing to do with reality or the real world. So don't confuse accuracy of depiction with realism, because these are not real. These are ideist imagery. They're metaphors, and not necessarily clear ones. Moods. My heart cries out for the past. I mean, if that's not a poetic phrase, and it evokes a range of different moods that different people will interpret in many different ways. It was in 92 that he met Peladon, that leader of that group, and Peladon loved his work and called him like the new Moreau, who we looked at last time. He was also very close to Belgian poets. This period in the 80s and 90s, all of the arts are closer than they've ever been. Poets are interacting with painters, who are interacting with composers, music, writing. They're all intermixed, and they're all talking about the same ideas. They're all influencing one another. Classic example in music is Debussy's Afternoon of a Faun. I mean, that is a pure symbolist piece of music. Debussy was very close to many of these writers. The Afternoon of a Faun comes from, that's Mallarmé, I think, the poem where he's telling it's an evocative poem that Debussy picks up in music. So all very, very closely linked. And that's going to continue into the 20th century, something that we'll talk about more later. His most famous work is this. His most sort of ambiguous and confusing works, sometimes called the Caress or Caresses of the Sphinx. Now, we know that this is a popular topic for the symbolists, Oedipus and the Sphinx, and we've seen it 2 other times previously, but his depiction is a little bit different. They're very sexual creatures in his work. It's interesting to compare this to Moreau's that we looked at last time. We talked about Moreau's version of the Oedipus and the Sphinx. In Moreau's version, now Moreau was a misogynist, first of all, and secondly, we talked about his Sphinx as a femme fatale, and how for him it symbolized sort of female physicality, and it was a threat to this sort of male intellectualism. Remember this idea that the symbolists were interested in this dichotomy between the physical and the spiritual, and realism symbolized all the things that were material and physical, and that was the evil. Well, that was also symbolized by the female, the femme fatale, and this very physical female body, where the male symbolized the intellectual, the spiritual, the mind, the opposite of matter in a way. And that's what he was doing in this painting of Oedipus and the Sphinx. She is this dangerous femme fatale, pouncing on him and locking his gaze, ready to destroy him. But we don't really see that in Knopf's at all. In fact, they seem to be, mutually involved in whatever it is that they're doing. She sort of, they cuddle up to one another. In both cases, the male figure is quite androgynous, even more so, I think, in Knopf. He's also changed the lion to a leopard, and we have this sort of woman with the long hair. Note in both of these the skewed format that the artist is using. Knopf has an exaggerated horizontal image, which is unusually horizontal, where Moreau has the exaggerated vertical. And whenever you have a format like this that's skewed outside of our expectations, it creates more tension. It creates a bit more anxiety. And lastly, this Knopf, which comes directly from a poem, a very well-known poem written by Christina Rossetti, who was the poet in the family, really, Dante Gabriel's sister. He was a poet as well, but she is better known as a poet. The poem itself is called Who Shall Deliver Me? And I'll read you a couple lines from it in a second. He's giving us this is an intensely modern image, by the way. There are many things going on here that foreshadow the 20th century. The importance of form and shape, his repetitions of these rectangles and squares over and over again, the compression of space. It's very flat. She's not in much of a space. She's pushed back very, very flat. Much of this, the techniques he's using is using form to create a mood. And when I say form, I mean the shapes he's using, the space he's creating, which is above and beyond any kind of story that he's telling. On the back wall here, you have a sculpture of Hypnos, and Hypnos is the Greek god of sleep and dreams. And we know that sleep and dreams is something that symbolists often refer to. It's a source for turning inward. I mean, if you're looking for something internal, it's in dreams, etc., where you find them. He referred to this as his palace of art, his studio. This does seem to be his real studio. He actually had this bust of Hypnos in his studio. The woman, I see pre-Raphaelite references here as well, the long red flowing hair. People have commented on her eyes. Is he trying to suggest that she is blind? That's what some people think, in which case that would be another symbolist reference to the turning inward, or even the non-seeing eyes. And we saw that before. They cut off from the material world, and therefore you turn inward to that world. The flowers as well, those elegant, beautiful flowers coming up are also symbolist. The poem itself, you can look it up online. It's longer than this. Who Shall Deliver Me is the name of it, but 2 lines where he gets the title. He gets the title for this painting. I lock my door upon myself and bar them out. But who shall wall self from self, most loathed of all? Myself, arch traitor to myself, my hollowest friend, my deadliest foe, my clog, whatever road I go. And this sort of turning on yourself is self-loathing. This is also sort of part of the symbolist movement, some of them anyway. Another name for the symbolist movement in the 90s is the decadent movement. They were sometimes referred to as the decadents. And they were sort of, world weary and tired of the corruption of the world. And it's a long and very complicated movement that takes many different forms. Delville, I won't spend much time on him. I'll just quickly show you. He dealt more with the messianic, and he was more involved in the occult. Now, this is the period in the 90s when in the Western world, people were absolutely obsessed with mysticism and the occult, with seances and mediums and plasma from ghosts, and vast numbers of people believed in all of this. This is when the Church of the Occult and various churches were created, and he was part of that messianic movement. Parzival is a reference to the Holy Grail, another theme that appears in symbolist art. Searching for the Holy Grail, that becomes a metaphor for a spiritual path. The search for the Holy Grail is really symbolic of a search between opposites. The Grail, if you know the story of the Grail was brought down to earth by what were called the neutral angels. And the neutral angels were in between the good angels and the evil angels. If you look at medieval mythology, they're looking back at a lot of medieval mythology here. That's where a lot of this comes from. Because if you're into mysticism, you're not going to look at the Renaissance. You're not going to look at the 16th, 17th, 18th century. You're going to go back to the Middle Ages, because that's the age of mysticism. That's the age where everybody believed in mystical things. So because the neutral angels brought the grail, and that's of course the cup of Christ, it becomes a metaphor for the balance of opposites. So if you're talking about spiritual, physical, mind, body, the grail is the perfect metaphor for searching for that sort of ideal position or spot. So because of that, Parsifal, the story of the Grail, are really popular in the 1890s. Wagner just premieres his new opera, Parsifal, which is about the search for the Holy Grail. So there's a lot of symbolist imagery dealing with the search for the Holy Grail. Orpheus, we've seen before. Remember, Orpheus was embraced because he symbolizes music, because he was a musician and a poet, so he's perfect in Greek mythology, but also because of how he died. He was torn apart by Maenads, and that's an important part of the story as well. The Maenads were these women followers of Dionysus, and so Dionysus symbolized excess, material excess during party, whatever, and his followers were all female. The religion was practiced only by women, and they would like drink and riot and then, you know, have these wild orgies. But in that wild state, they killed Orpheus and ripped him to pieces. And so he is the artist, the mind, the spirit, torn apart by, again, women and physical, material women. So again, it's the symbol of, you know, the spiritual and the physical, you know, the real versus the ideal. And so the thing about Orpheus is, though, after he died, his head floated down the river on his lyre, on his musical instrument, but he was still singing. So again, it's the, you know, you can't shut the artist up, you know, the artist is going to continue and all of that. So it's a perfect symbol. It's why we see Orpheus depicted over and over again in symbolist art. I'm going to skip these last two and move on to our friend Klimt. He's one of the better known of the symbolists. Many people are familiar with Klimt, an Austrian, lived in Vienna. I love these images. Well, first of all, I love that, you know, it's late enough in time that we can have photographs of artists, because I like looking at them. But I love this one, because anybody who loves his cat is okay. So that's a particularly nice photo. He eventually became president of the Vienna Secession. Now, remember, when you get outside of France, we still have academies. You know, there's academies in Munich and Dresden, and several in Germany, Berlin, Munich. There's an academy in Vienna, and they all have their salons. What we don't have in all those places is the beginning of an avant-garde like we did in France, because none of the other academies were restrictive the way the French Academy was. French Academy forced out all the good artists because they were so restrictive and so narrow-minded that an avant-garde developed in France, and they became the leaders of, you know, what's going to happen in the 20th century. But those things didn't happen anywhere else in Europe. All artists were welcome in their academies and their salons, which meant they never were ostracized, so they never formed an avant-garde, so they really weren't the leaders. It really is true. You need opposition to grow. You really do. And you see this in art over and over again. We'll see it in the 20th century, where it's really kind of understood a bit more. However, there was a series of what were called secession movements in the 90s. Every one of these places eventually had a secession. You didn't have one in London. You certainly didn't have one in France, because they'd left the academy decades before. But you had the Vienna secession, you had the Munich secession, the Berlin secession. And this was closest to a group breaking apart. seceding from the official group and forming somewhat of an avant-garde. And Klimt was part of that. He became the president eventually of the Vienna secession group, and he wrote and contributed to their journal in Vienna. So there was quite a symbolist group in Vienna. He was also very closely tied to Art Nouveau movement. They're all happening now in the second half of the 90s. We'll get to Art Nouveau next week. But it is linked to the symbolists formally, if nothing else, because Klimt did a lot of murals and decorative pieces on walls and for people's homes. He gets often linked with Art Nouveau, which is not a fine art movement, it's a decorative art movement. It's about architectural design, interior design, objects, and things like that, functional things. He really crosses over between the two. In German-speaking countries, it's known as Jugendstil. Every country had its own name for Art Nouveau. Art Nouveau just means the new art in French, but you're not going to call it by its French name. You're going to call it whatever the words for new art is where you live. And Jugendstil means the new art in German. So Jugendstil is the German equivalent. His first big commission was for a set of murals to go at the University of Vienna, the new medical school. They were building a new building, and he was commissioned to do 3 walls in this new building. They were very controversial and they were rejected. They never went up, but once they saw his studies, I'll show you a couple of these. These are studies for the mural that was dedicated to medicine. One wall was supposed to be dedicated to medicine, one to jurisprudence, basically law, and then the third to philosophy. And of course, they expected him to do very traditional allegories to symbolize each of these disciplines, but he took a symbolist approach, as more of a more metaphorical approach. And when they saw these studies, they were outraged, not so much by the one on the left, but definitely the one on the right. Why is there a naked woman floating in the sky? This is about medicine. You know, what's that got to do with medicine? And this is a symbolist approach. What he did is he approached each of these 3 not as realistic actual subjects that people studied, but as symbolic states of the human condition, which is lovely. But the medical school and the university didn't want symbolic states of the human condition. So they were rejected, but they are showing you early on the direction that Klimt is going to take. His most famous work, however, he made for the what's known as the secession building. The Vienna secession group had a new building built, and we aren't going to go into the architecture of that building, but it was symbolic of this symbolist style. It's really a beautiful building. And in that building, they had in 1902 an exhibition dedicated to Beethoven. And it was an anniversary of something. I don't remember the details, but they were going to have art and things symbolizing Beethoven. And so Klimt did this mural that we'll look at more details of, which is a totally free interpretation of the last movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. So here, instead of poetry, it's music that's inspiring him. It's all about sound. And now, there is no way on earth I'm going to interpret any of this for you, because it's not literal. They're dream-like scenes, but there is a kind of overall theme, and that is man's search for happiness or search for the ideal, which is, again, a very symbolist idea, presented in the form of a quest, a knight going on a quest. I mean, how medieval can you get? This is very much like the search for the Holy Grail. It's just different words describing some heroic figure going out and searching for an ideal in the world. And so it's just filled with fantastic images like this. It's marvelous. I have no idea what he's thinking, but it's sound is a free interpretation of sounds and the idea of a quest and the various figures that he would encounter. one of the things that he does, now here's the night surrounded by the figures, beautiful texture and surfaces. Now there's a lot of real gold and silver and other materials on the surface here. And it's largely influenced by mosaics from the Middle Ages, as I'll talk about more. It sort of ends with these figures like the quest is complete, the knight has found his ideal, and the figures are sort of merging in this magical, mystical world that's almost like hallucinogenic. I think that's the best way to think of it. Don't think of it as anything you're ever going to see. It's like a hallucination as the world sort of dissolves around them. Now, one of the biggest influences, if you were with me last year when we did the Western survey, which I'll do again next year coming up, we looked at medieval art, and one of the pieces we looked at was this mosaic from Ravenna, Italy, of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian. And this is all mosaic, covered with like gold leaf and beautiful materials. Now, Klimt had made a trip to Ravenna in Italy specifically to see these murals. They were famous then, they're famous now. And there's no question that they have a huge influence on his work. Not only the sort of flatness of the forms, the use of gold and silver, but the sort of sameness of the figures, just like these guys are all sort of identical, the way they're sort of floating in space, you know, they're not really standing firmly on the ground, the flatness of them, all of this is very Byzantine. That's a major influence on his style. There's sort of that mysticism of the period. And he takes it, you know, well beyond that and into paintings like this. This is a really beautiful, he did two of these. This is Judith, one of two. Now, Judith, of course, is a heroine of not the official Bible. It's from the Apocrypha, the book of Judith. And Judith has been a popular figure in art. She is a heroine. She's a Jewish heroine who makes a sacrifice. Now, here's a typical depiction of Judith. Judith, not Judas. This is by Artemisia Gentileschi. She painted this in the 17th century. It's probably the most well-known today, the most famous image of Judith. And what Klimt is doing is totally reinterpreting the story. What he's depicting has nothing to do with the story of Judith. Judith is a heroine. She saved her people by Holofernes was an Assyrian king. He wanted her, so she went to spend the night with him, and then in the middle of the night, she and her servant cut his head off and saved everyone. So she's a hero, but Klimt is depicting her in a very different way. In fact, he's presenting her in a way that is closer to all of those Salome images we saw than the biblical hero. He's turned her, because a man lost his head, just like Salome took the head of John the Baptist. Judith is turned into a femme fatale, which she has never been seen that way. But now she's just another deadly sexual woman who's bringing about the downfall of a man. So again, it's materialism, destroying the ideal, destroying the spiritual, i.e. male. And he makes her just lascivious here, of the way he's showing her. And you almost don't even notice this head that's hidden down here at the bottom. But notice the way he's combining the 2D and the 3D, the way we're getting, you know, her flesh, her face. This is very three-dimensional and very carved, but everything else is completely flat. It's a completely different space. And that creates an incredible tension. It's like, is she breaking free from the surface? How are we supposed to see her in relation to this reality? In other words, he's speaking two languages simultaneously. He's speaking a three-dimensional language and a two-dimensional language, and they're fighting with one another as they're trying to speak to us. I love that look on her face. It's so blatant and it's so symbolist. I mean, this could only be a have been created in a particular moment in time. Of course, his most well-known and the work that I don't know if it still is, but for a very long time, a poster of this was hanging in every dorm room that I ever encountered. You know, this has always been really popular with college students. I think it still is. It really is a beautiful image, but it's a very good example of his decorative style. But one thing I would point out is the way the two figures are melting together. You have one outline around them. The symbolists use shape, they use form, they all use form in powerful communicative ways. And in this case, that single shape around them sort of merges them. One theme we've seen and we'll see again in symbolist art is that love almost always is tragic. It's almost always, you know, it's more like it's over the top, it's insane, it's a loss of self, it's tragedy. You know, it's never just a simple happy love story, everybody lives happily ever after. It's always something about it that's tragic. And he suggests, now there's something tragic in this image, it's sort of over the top, out of control in a way, but the way one figure is sort of merging over the other, it's like absorbing the other one, it's sort of disappearing. It's not obvious here, but it will be in some later works. Very popular portrait painter as well, extremely popular. Everybody wanted their portraits painted by Klimt because I think they are stunningly beautiful and they're very odd, you know, they're very different. Yes, it's a portrait, but then again, you dissolve in this beautiful abstract design. Hodler also, well, not also anything, Swiss. I'm just going to, we'll probably just look at one of his works maybe. Hodler started out as a landscape painter and was tied to the real world, but he eventually met a lot of people, a lot of symbolists. He became part of that circle, visited Paris. And in Paris, he actually, and this was in the 80s, and what he saw in Paris, he saw the Café Voltaire exhibition, that first exhibition of the symbolists in Paris, that was Gauguin and his students, the Nabi. Remember those early symbolists experimenting with it? He saw them and they had a huge impact. I can see it in a work like this. So he completely sort of converted from being a realist landscape painter to an ideist, and he was soon noticed by Peladon. Now, something like this, he invented this style he calls parallelism, and it basically just means you take a lot of things and put them parallel to one another. And we're going to see it in a couple different ways. But something like this, you know, again, what does this mean? He meant it to be about the sort of totality of diverse sort of experiences when you're sleeping at night. The central figure, the sleeper, has this sort of ominous form above it. There was an inscription on the original frame, which is not there anymore, but the inscription was, "More than one man has gone to sleep calmly in the evening, not to wake up again in the morning." So he's linking, you know, sleep and death and the like. And I'm going to point out also that by the 1890s, Freud is writing. Early writings by Freud are out there if you can read German. His impact is going to be much stronger after 1920. As we'll see, that's when the surrealists get involved, because that's when all of his writings are translated into a lot of different languages, and he's written a lot more by 1920. But he is out there, and people are sort of talking about this new guy who's saying weird things. So just throwing that out. Now, when I look at this, I can't help but be reminded of a fairly well-known work by Fuseli, who was working in England about 100 years earlier. This is a really well-known piece, actually, The Nightmare. If you haven't seen it before, it's often reproduced, also very popular with students. And you have this collapsing woman and this incubus figure sitting on her, this sort of monster creature, signifying sleep, dream, nightmare. Incubus is what comes to a woman in her sleep, and it's sort of a terrifying male figure that sort of saps all your energy. But you're not going to see the symbolists doing this because they're not concerned about women. Their concern is what women do to men, not what men do to women. So you're going to see the opposite here with now the male figure, and we don't know what's under that hood, but the implications is it's some kind of succubus, which is the female version of the nightmare. It's just a reversal. But again, it's sapping your energy and everything about you. Skip that, skip that. He does this interesting one in 92. Remember, he was a landscape painter, but this is now his symbolist interpretation. Remember, in the hands of the symbolist, the landscape or nature becomes a place of mysticism, a mystical place, a magical place. And, he uses this one point perspective to draw your eye to this point, and then these parallel trees to draw you in. This is the period, I mentioned this before, when people like Pissarro, Monet in his Poplar series that we looked at, where he had all the trees lined up. They're seeing Hodler, they're seeing symbolists use these repetitions of parallel forms to draw you along. And Pissarro's doing this similar thing. Now, I love this Pissarro. I love all Pissarros, but this one is just so beautiful. But, the rhythm, rhythm is a powerful thing in art. When you set up a rhythm and a pattern, you can pull people along. You can affect emotions. You can affect how they see the piece. And Pissarro is like pulling your eye down along this road in the same way that Hodler is. So this is an influence from Hodler. My guy, Böcklin, I love Böcklin. We're going to encounter Böcklin when we look at 20th century art. He has some important students. Arnold Böcklin, Swiss, I love that self-portrait. I could do a whole class on self-portraits. It's one of my favorite things in art. And we've looked at some already. We'll look at more in the 20th century. Swiss born, but actually spent a lot of time in Germany. And eventually chose Italy and settled in Italy. And it was while he was in Italy for the latter part of his life that he was the teacher of a very important Italian artist named Giorgio de Chirico, who's a major influence on the Surrealists. So there's a direct line here through so many of these Surrealists, through various, symbolists, through various people, right to the Surrealists, as we'll see later. This is one of his most famous pieces. He really developed this image of this mystical sort of shrouded figure. They're sort of undifferentiated, these sort of stretched, tight shrouds, some sort of ritual, again, the sacred wood. It's a beautiful landscape painting. Even, could take the people out and it would be a nice landscape painting, but he totally redefines and reinvents the landscape here because of these shrouded figures. Who are they? What's going on? Again, it's that suggestiveness, that evocativeness of the symbolist, as opposed to like the Romantics. And then just quickly, the Island of the Dead, he did several versions of this, where again, you have that shrouded figure again, now being rowed to this mystical, sort of classical island. So he's really creating an environment, and it's this sort of imagery that so affects the Surrealists. Here's another version. He had 5 different versions of this particular scene. But my favorite comparison is this self-portrait of Böcklin, which again, one of my favorite self-portraits of all time. And there are some wonderful self-portraits. Portrait with the Dead, self-portrait with death, where he's sort of listening as the death is sort of playing the alluring violin, and he's sort of listening and being called. That fascination with, again, these universal themes, death. And but it's most interesting when you compare it to the work of somebody working at the same time. Now, we're not going to look at the work of Lovis Corinth. He is a German artist who is a realist. And what I love is how these two relate to one another. Corinth is an artist, and he's depicting himself as an artist. He's in an artist studio. The windows identify this as an artist studio space. Artist studio spaces typically had, and quite often still do have, a skeleton in them. You use them for anatomical studies. You use them when you need to see how the human body moves and works. He's a realist. This is the city he lives in, the clothes he wears, the skeleton that hangs in his studio. This is a realist interpretation, where Böcklin is giving us the symbolist interpretation. Yes, he's an artist, he's in his studio, but his skeleton is now a metaphor. It's not a real thing hanging there. It's a metaphor for an idea. And what I love about it, even though Böcklin's is much earlier, because he's clearly quite young here, they really were both working at the same time. And each of them working, in the same city or near one another, are representing these two factions that are driving art: the realists and the anti-realists, those who believe they are the avant-garde because it's avant-garde and modern to tell the truth about the world you live in. And we've seen that idea since 1850 has dominated through all these realists. And now this new voice, these anti-realists that come along at the end of the century and say, no, that's base, that's common, that's ordinary, that's lowly. We need to elevate art. It should be ideal. It should be above that. It should be more important than the mundane. And side by side, they're still, hashing it out. Now, what is going to be really interesting when we come back together again in the spring is what happens to this argument. Where does it go when the 20th century hits? I'm not going to tell you. You're going to have to come back and find out. Last painter I want to look at is someone you may or may not think of in this context. And that is a Norwegian painter named Edvard Munch. Again, he's quite well known today. There was a huge symbolist circles all over Scandinavia, not just in Norway. Deep roots in symbolist poetry, in particular in Scandinavia. So there were circles, philosophers, a lot there, going back to St. Bridget. I mean, going back into the Middle Ages. Mysticism has been part of Scandinavian mythology in the Scandinavian world for generations. So it shouldn't be surprising that Scandinavia is going to embrace this more mystical symbolist approach than it is the realist approach. And Munch is certainly one of the foremost. He came from a very religious family. I mean, extreme religion. His mother and sister died. His mother was like a extreme over the top religious, and that affected him. His mother and sister died fairly young. He never married. His life was rather tragic. He had more than one really destructive love affair, one of them with the wife of a very close friend of his, a poet. Childhood illnesses shaped his life, death shaped his life, religious obsession, extreme psychic states affected his life, defined his life and his art. In fact, he created, in fact, you can see a lot of them back here. This is him in his studio. He made at one point a whole series of paintings that he called the frieze of life. And each painting was dedicated to like a human condition or human state, an emotional state. And, some of them we're familiar with. Self-portrait. I mean, this is so far removed from a realist self-portrait. I mean, this is so moody in the light and mystical light. It's a really nice portrait. He was quite well known fairly early and was often invited to different places. He spent a few years in Paris, and then he was invited to Berlin, and he worked in Berlin from 92 to 95. And in fact, many of his most famous works were actually painted while he was in Berlin. In fact, many of them that we're familiar with. Here's a one from 93, a death chamber, symbolist theme, death, states of consciousness, extreme emotional states, because he's focusing not on the person who has died. Typically, you'll see someone in a bed and some mourners around them, but you don't even see the person. This is totally about the impact of death on those around. And it's a really interesting depiction of it, because again, it's not a realist depiction at all. These wonderful shapes, this is what he was known for, these sort of curvilinear shapes, like figures are like melting or floating. They're not like real, they're dissolving. It's like you're in such an intense anxious state that it's almost like an out-of-body experience. Have you ever been in a state like that where things are just so horrible you can't believe they're real, and it's like you're not in your body for a moment, you're just sort of floating there, and that's what these feel like. And his colors do that too. Look at sickly green, look at her face, and it's very skeletal, but she's not like even alive at the moment. It feels like even the furniture seems to be dissolving. The space is skewed and tilted up, the floor and the point of view. It's a powerful image. He did 2 or 3 on this subject. Of course, this most famous piece that everybody knows now, the Scream. All these were done while he was in Germany. The Scream is about terror and fear. He says it's about fear of nature. He didn't mean I'm afraid to go out in the woods. He means, when he says nature, he means the physical world. This is a sort of symbolist statement, the fear of physicality, the fear of the natural physical. And of course, the question is, what is the scream? Is that referring to what the figure is doing? Is the figure screaming, or does it refer to something the figure is hearing because the hands are over the ears? Now, this is someone who in the 90s is very, very aware of the power of form. There are a few artists who are more aware than others of how powerful form can be in communicating meaning. And this painting communicates meaning very much through form, shapes, and colors. Oops. First of all, the space. The space is disturbing. It causes anxiety in its own right. The sharp angle. It's the whole thing is a study in contrast, sharp contrast. You have, first of all these fluid curvilinear forms, and then this one sharp, jagged, angular form that play off against one another. Nothing in between. It's either completely fluid or it's completely sharp and jagged. The colors, we have complementary colors. The orange and the blue are complements. So, you can't get anything further apart than 2 complements. They play on one another. The space is completely flat, and yet there's a perspective that goes back in space. There's a real tension here between the 2D and the 3D. This lays flat, but at the same time, those look like boats, and that's a bridge, so that must be water. But this thing seems to rise up above the water, which flattens it out again. So do we read this going back in space? If you view it from the left to the right, coming in this way, you're reading this as far away in space. But then by the time you get over here, it's completely flat. If you read from the right to the left, this is just flat. And so they kind of meet in the middle in this tension as to where are things? I don't know how to read them. It reminds me of what Manet was doing in the bar at the Folies Bergère. Remember the bar at the Folies Bergère where he's playing with space? He skewed that reflection in the mirror. It was off to the side and things couldn't have been. He created anxiety by skewing the space intentionally. And that was in the 80s. So these are artists who are beginning to think about how they can use shapes and colors and spatial relationships to create a mood. This would be disturbing even if you didn't have a figure standing there screaming, because of the shapes, because of the colors and the lines and the space. And like, who are these guys? Are they vaguely ominous? Do they have something to do with it? It's unclear. puberty. This is his version of the femme fatale. Again, human states. This is sort of anxiety again, the awakening of sexual power in a young woman. Boy, this is just a femme fatale about to be born, about to come into her own. Looms, this shadow that looms up. This is like her sexuality that's sort of rising above and looming over her. Latent sexuality, Sigmund Freud, 94, it's out there. She's already fearful. There's also, Freud has already made the link between women and death, by the way. If you haven't read Freud, he's pretty misogynistic in his own right. Not pretty, not extremely. The dance of life, not a new idea, using dance as a metaphor for human relationships, or for basically sexual relationships, or the complications of sexual relationships, expressed in terms of the idea of a dance. That dance of life is not a new idea. It's in literature, it's in film, it's a very common and I think fairly natural sort of association. But again, hallucinatory. I like the mask-like, that they're all wearing masks. Is that what life is? Is that what relationships are? People wearing masks and doing this dance? It really raises the questions. It doesn't give you the answers, but it makes you think about it. It's in many versions of the kiss. Another expression of this, where one figure is being absorbed by the other. Once again, you get this sort of universal shape that seems to be, two figures are becoming one in a way that almost suggests a loss of identity, a loss of individuality. It's hard to not see one after the other and not read it as, well, this is coming from somewhere. Remember what we talked about last time, this is this period where the femme fatale is in her own. Men are having to deal with women in the workplace. You've got the new woman out there. The world's changing dramatically, and all these psychological fears are coming out into the open, and we see it everywhere. And I love this vampire. He did a number of these. He did paintings, several paintings. He did a number of prints. First of all, Bram Stoker's Dracula was published in 1892. And if you haven't read Stoker's Dracula, which everybody should, it's an important book. It's more than anything, the terrifying thing in that book are the women. Yes, there's Dracula, but he's surrounded by these three women that are vampires, and they are the ones that are the threat to all the men in the story. It's these three women every time they appear. So for much of late 19th and early 20th century vampire stories, they're about the femme fatale. And if you read books and watch old movies, particularly from the 30s or 40s, not so much the 40s, but the 30s, you will see all these women who are referred to as vamps. And I'm sure you've heard that reflection, the women are vamps. Being a vampire meant you were a woman that basically sucks the life out of a man. That's what a vamp was, linked to a vampire. So this book was written by a woman. No, it was written by Bram Stoker. Well, that's right. You're thinking of Mary Shelley, Frankenstein. Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good book too. Everybody should read that. Stoker, yeah, well, that's another whole story. Yeah, he's another interesting person. But this reference to the vampire doesn't necessarily mean she's biting his neck. It's a reference to a femme fatale, a redheaded one again, like the pre-Raphaelites, as we're going to see. Sexuality and red hair were linked, and long hair was linked to sexuality. And now you may have been wondering, where do we put our friend Rodin, and why haven't we looked at much sculpture in this class? We haven't looked at much sculpture because the 19th century is not a great age for sculpture. There wasn't much going on. And that's because sculpture has its own completely different history and tradition. Sculpture traditionally in the Western world has functioned as monument. And when you look back at the history of sculpture prior to the 20th century, probably at least 95% of it is memorial. It's number one, the human form, human figure, and it's memorializing someone, either a religious figure, a saint, a general, an emperor, something. And it's a whole different historical tradition than something like painting. And it's largely stays in that tradition till the end of the 19th century. Rodin is one of the first artists to break from that. There are some exceptions in Romantic period where some Romantic sculptors were doing images of sort of wild animals and the like. But Rodin is the first to really begin to make a change. And I don't really have time to go into his whole life and deal with it, so I won't. His first major work, he actually tried earlier on, years before this, to get into the École des Beaux-Arts, or the school, the official school for sculpture. He couldn't get in. He was turned down 2 or 3 times, but there was always work during the Second Empire. And that was like Napoleon III, remember, like from 51 up to 1870. There was always work for sculptors because it was a huge building boom. And so there was always need for architectural sculpture and decorative arts and sculpture and details for all this architecture. But when the Second Empire fell in 71 and the Third Republic began, there was a kind of economic collapse a bit. The housing, the building boom ended, and a lot of those people were out of work. So he took the opportunity to go back and try being an artist again, stop doing just this architectural work and be an artist. And this is the first major work he exhibited at the Salon in 77, and it caused a huge scandal, primarily because it was so accurate proportionally to the human form that they accused him of casting it from a live model, which he didn't do. But it did sort of sour him. And from that moment on, he never made another life-size figure. They were always going to be larger than life-size or smaller than life-size. So nobody could accuse him of casting it from life. Now, this is quite revolutionary. First of all, the Age of Bronze is an intriguing title and very evocative and suggests a lot of different things. Nude figures are not new, but nude figures in art, going back to the ancient Greeks, have typically symbolized the heroic. We saw it in David, we've seen it in painters, heroic figures. This does not symbolize heroism at all. This is a symbolist interpretation. It's a metaphor of something. This guy is in torment and angst, his positions. You're going to see his figures are all in interesting positions, and they're suggestive without specifically telling you anything. The other thing I want to say about Rodin is he never made actually any of his bronze figures or any of the plaster casts from which they were made. He worked in clay, and I've talked about this before. And it's typical of most sculptors. He made works in clay, then he handed them off to skilled craftspeople who would then cast them in plaster. And often the plaster casts were exhibited. There were galleries that just showed plasters. There were even rooms at the official salon that would have plaster casts literally exhibited. And then from there, if they were then going to be cast in bronze, then they would be passed on to a master metal worker who would then cast them in bronze. But Rodin himself never cast anything in bronze. Some of them were cast during his lifetime. Many of them were cast well after his lifetime. But I want to just really focus on his most important work, one that he spent most of his life on, some 37 years, and it was still never really finished. And that is the commission for the great the gates of hell, the bronze doors. He was commissioned to do these. In Paris, they were building a new Museum of Decorative Arts, and he was commissioned before the building was even built to create these massive bronze doors as an entranceway. Now, the tradition of bronze doors as monuments on major buildings is not new. It goes back to the late Middle Ages and was popular throughout the Renaissance. And as many of you know, we have a copy of these gates at the Nelson Gallery. This is one of the most famous, is Ghiberti's Gates of Paradise. The Nelson Gallery has a cast of these that was made from us. So you can actually go to the Nelson and see. The original bronze doors are no longer, they were made for the Florence Baptistry, but the ones on the Florence Baptistry are also a cast of the original, made from the original, and the original is now in a museum. So that tradition is longstanding, and this is tapping into that tradition. These, of course, were, and typically in the Renaissance and the Middle Ages, they would have been religious scenes. That's what it's about. But that is not what we have here. Ghiberti and most of the earlier ones, they would have been broken into, regimented, segmented little vignettes or scenes, where Rodin is giving us this one roiling scene of individuals. Okay, so what we're looking at here then, and I got to tell you, 37 years, his ideas changed over time as to what this was and how you interpret things. One reason he had so much trouble getting it finished is, the politics, just plain old politics. You've got, a museum is controlled by certain people, you got boards of directors, they change over time, different people want different things over time, and new board says, no, we don't want this, we want that. And something that takes that long, you're never going to get it finished because everything changes so much. And he changed his own ideas about what he meant. Okay, so first of all, originally it was supposed to be based on Dante's Inferno, which is a very popular 19th century subject, written in the Middle Ages, the Divine Comedy, but the Inferno has always been the most popular of the books. And many, many artists illustrated Dante in the 19th century. So that's what it was supposed to be originally. The pillar on this side is supposed to depict many aspects of the lives of women. The one on the right depicts various scenes of male and female relationships, whatever. And the doors down here, this is basically hell, and we'll talk about how he depicts that in a minute. And then up above, this is the Last Judgment, a popular religious scene. And then the figure out here in the middle, which you probably recognize as the thinker, he originally meant to be Dante when it was supposed to be Dante's Inferno, but he later changed his mind as to who that might represent. Figures on top, he changed his mind about as well. Now, many of the figures on these doors were cast separately as freestanding separate figures, as well as being figures on these doors. So some of them you're going to recognize in different contexts. Now,
how big is this?
Pardon?
How big is this?
I think it's about 17 foot tall. It's big.
Okay.
I mean, these are big, massive doors.
Thank you.
Big, heavy, massive doors. Two things that influenced him on his view of hell, and I forgot to say this before I moved, his view of hell, rather than being broken down into like little discrete geometric segments of hell, is like this boiling, roiling sea of storm and figures rising up and sinking down. And it's very much a symbolist interpretation visually of how to present hell. He's influenced by a couple different things. One of them is the various other depictions of hell, of Dante's version of hell, including Blake. William Blake has done one of the most famous interpretations in series of prints of Dante's Inferno, and this is Virgil and Dante at the gates of hell, and he has above it his sort of statements abandon all hope. What it says above the door in Dante, above the door gates to hell, it says abandon all hope, ye who enter here. And as we'll go back to the gates in a minute, and it does say that he put that above the gates, linking it to Dante. And then also he's influenced by Michelangelo's Last Judgment, which is on the back wall of the Sistine Chapel, which again, if you do the Western course, if I do that again, we'll cover that here. But it's also for the time. This is done in about 1530, 35. It is a new style where Michelangelo is breaking away from his Renaissance style, and it's much more emotional. And again, it's all these figures, things going on, and different groups of figures with one central figure sort of looking over the whole thing. He really kind of wanted to outdo Michelangelo. I think that was very much part of it. So let's look at some of the figures. These three figures at the top, these massive figures. Now, these take on different forms. They're usually identified as the shades, or three shades. Shades is a reference to basically souls of the damned. These would be damned figures who are all sort of weighted and being pulled down, very symbolist poses, these exaggerated gestures, and they're all pointing to this inscription, of abandoned hope. These were also, however, cast individually. And when he did that, he referred to them as Adam. And we have one of them in the Nelson Gallery. There is one of the large, I can't remember how big it is, one of the cast figures of one of these in the Nelson identified as Adam. So, he really totally changes and rethinks what he means by them. But they're very symbolist in that the shapes are what evoke the emotion. This is 100% communicated through form, through shape, their body positions. The other thing I want to point out about the nude and why the symbolists love the nude no longer is limited at this point in time to the idea of heroism. That link is broken by the symbolists. But if you are looking to communicate the idea of universals and universal ideals, the nude is the way to do it. You want to remove those clothes. A realist would put clothes on them. A symbolist would take the clothes off. Remember, to name a thing is to destroy a thing. The minute you put clothes on someone, you've limited them. You've locked them into a moment in time, a place, a time. I know those clothes. You're from 1875. They're French. I recognize the style. You've immediately limited the meaning because you've linked it. And a symbolist doesn't want to do that. They want to universalize it. So you remove clothes, could be any time, anywhere, anyone, nothing more universal than the nude body. So it's a different way of thinking about the nude form. Hadn't really been thought about before. Even in forms like those positions, he's influenced by Michelangelo. Michelangelo did a set of sculptures, and it was always debated whether he intended these to be finished. These were sold and purchased in this form, but many people believed no, these were just unfinished. He would never in the Renaissance leave a work like this. It's too abstract an idea to leave a half-carved piece. You just didn't do this in the Renaissance. But more and more people now are believing that he really did mean these to be left like this, because it emphasized these are identified as slaves. And so they're like trapped in the stone and they're weighted down and they're limited. But whether he meant it or not, we're not talking about Renaissance art. What matters is what Rodin saw in these, and they were quite well known. So he saw these symbolist shapes and forms. So you're seeing Michelangelo being in a model here for another group of artists. Now, we're going to look at this sort of Last Judgment here in just a minute. He changed it. What he did when he gave up on the idea of literally depicting Dante, because he didn't want to do that. Dante has clear descriptions of different levels of hell and what goes on there, and he's not going to do that. So he gave up on that, and he turned it from an allegory into a metaphor. And that's what the symbolists do. An allegory is what we've seen in art going back like forever. An allegory is where basically one thing stands for another. You can look it up in a book. A candle means this. If the candle's lit, it means that. If it's burned out, it means this. If you see a dog, that symbolizes fidelity, right? We've seen that. If you see a cat, symbolizes something else. That's an allegory. It's more of a visual symbol. These artists, because of their link to the literary tradition and to poets, we're seeing something that we see more in a literary tradition, and that is metaphor. And a metaphor is different. It's not a one-on-one symbol. It's where you talk about one thing, but you actually mean something else entirely. That's a metaphor. And it's more vague. It's not specific. You can't look it up in a book, but it's a literary tradition. And that's what he's doing here. And particularly, what he's doing is not looking at the hell of the Bible. The symbolists, most of the symbolists use a lot of religious imagery, but they're not religious people. They're using it as a metaphor for something else. We saw that with the Nabit. In this case, hell as a modern condition rather than a religious concept. So see what we mean by that. Here's our friend, the thinker, which we also have one of at the Nelson, of course. Isolated from context, the meaning is entirely 100% different. He's sitting here in front of the Last Judgment. He's being surrounded by this world of chaos and death and people being massacred. It's a world of emotion, intense emotion and feeling. And right in the middle of that world is this guy sitting there. It's meant to symbolize, in this context, it symbolizes the impotence of reason in a world of emotion. It's not a positive thing. It's not, oh, great. It's not about, it's about the failure of intellectualism, that the world is not an intellectual world. This guy is totally impotent because the world around him is not something he can rationalize and understand. Now, when you remove him from that context, all that meaning is gone, is lost. There's no way you can look at a single freestanding figure of the thinker and think of it in terms of meaning, the impotence of rationalism. So it really kind of loses its meaning. In fact, I don't even like thinking of it outside the context of the gates. That's where it exists for me. It's meaningless and therefore is often totally misunderstood. I'm not sure he meant the separate piece to have any meaning at all. His intent was that this figure exists there and have that meaning. He allowed them to make copies of it and sell them separately because he needed to make money. I honestly don't believe that there was any meaning or intent behind the freestanding ones. It's just what you did because it, paid the bills. That's the thinker. And then I have to show you my favorite Rodin. Lastly, the Crouching Woman. This has nothing to do with the Gates of Hell. It's a freestanding piece. It's absolutely stunning. Classic example of a symbolist sculpture. That shape, that wonderful enclosed upon herself shape. It's so evocative and so emotional and powerful. The other thing I would say about this piece is when he exhibited this piece, he had this recessed into the floor. He didn't want it to be on a pedestal or a base. Now think about sculpture. Every time you see sculpture, it's on something in some way that separates it from the world. There's a pedestal there, there's a base, it's roped off. There's something that identifies that as not being of our world. It's separate. He didn't want that separation. So such a simple little thing, embedding this in the floor so that you're walking through it and there's no separation, and it's 3D anyway, so it's already in our reality in ways that paintings are not. That was really a huge step, and it's going to have a huge impact on 20th century artists. I think at the time it didn't have that much meaning to most people, but the importance of that will be recognized.
How big is that?
Life size, approximate. Well, you know, he's going to make it slightly larger or smaller. I think it's slightly smaller, but roughly. And then I know I'm running way over, but I'm not going to skip Camille Claudel because we need to look at her. Anybody seen one of the movies on her life? There have been two movies made about her life, one in the 80s, a French movie, and then in 2015, one on her late life. It covers 3 years of her life in the mental asylum. She was an important artist. She was Rodin's assistant, his student, his mistress. They had a passionate affair. She seems to have been somewhat disturbed all along. When he sort of broke with her, she never recovered from that. She ended up spending most of the rest of her life in an asylum, 30 years of her life in a mental asylum. She is a fascinating character. I want to look briefly at two works because she not only expresses a symbolist ideal, but her own state of mind. Now, this is like 17 inches high, so this is small bronze. Waltz, again, the dance of life metaphor, the idea of life as a dance. This is about male and female here, dancing life. This is totally about her and Rodin in the dance as the figure seems to be melting. She originally did not have this sort of whatever this is meant to be. It was just the two figures. People complained about it. They said it was, you know, inappropriate because of the way they're touching. It's a little too erotic. And so she added this little bit to it. But nonetheless, its tradition is certainly one we've seen before. The two figures, you know, wrapped around one another and one consuming the other. But I think more important piece that really speaks to her state of mind is abandon. This one's a little taller, but the two figures, one bending over and embracing the other. In this case, it appears to be the female figure that is above the other figure. And it's, of course, reminiscent of the format of what we saw here with the Klimt. So very powerful piece. What I need to do is stop sharing for a minute and then reshare something else. What the heck just happened? You are now sharing. Okay. Stop sharing. Thank you. Now I want to share this. Why can't I share this other screen?
Did you select that other screen? So when you go to share screen, it should come up with all of the little windows.
Yeah.
And then you
But when I
select-
opened it, the other one is share. I stopped sharing. Now I want to select this one. How do I get that little share thing
Okay,
back?
so go to share screen.
I can't find share screen. That's the problem. I don't see a share screen.
Is it in your tool menu,
I have no
toolbar down
tool.
at the bottom?
I have no tool menu. It disappeared. Maybe if I go over here, I'll get a tool menu. I should get a tool. I'm in the Zoom meeting. Why am I? Oh, okay, it's back. It's back. Here it is. It just popped up. It just popped up. Yes, it finally popped up. Thank you. Sorry.
That's okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
That should. Yes, that did it. Okay. Don't have much time. Sorry. But I find it hard to skip things that are important. Okay. We haven't looked at a lot of Britain, so I wanted to look at Victorian, what we have, and we'll finish it off last time. Next time, I can finish this off and do Art Nouveau. We have time for that. I don't really need to spend a lot of time on arts and crafts because I'm not going to do furniture and architecture and all that anyway. The influence of Victoria is widespread in Europe, not just in London, but everywhere. You know, she was depicted as the mother of the nation. What's interesting is she had no political power, but she had absolute social power. The power she had was incredible in shaping that nation through all of the years that she ruled as queen. Her most popular, her favorite artist was Edwin Landseer. Now, I'm not looking at this because of the painter, but because of the subject that's depicted. She found a way to successfully present herself that other queens from earlier periods could not. You know, I like this painting because of how casual it is, how informal it is. And queens really, there's a very particular painting of Marie Antoinette with her children that some of you may know that got her in a lot of trouble, where she was incapable of really presenting herself in a casual or informal way. But Victoria manages to do that. This is obviously very early. She's very young. She only has one child. What did she have, like 9 of them or some 7 or 9 or some a whole lot anyway. This was popular British art at the time. You know, Britain, just like everywhere else in Europe, you know, had an academy, a royal academy, and it was a little more open than the French academy. What I want to look at is what we call anecdotal art. The British tradition in visual arts is so tightly connected to literature that you cannot separate them. All British art is literary during this century. And, you know, we've talked about this before. British painters always found themselves or thought of themselves as inferior to artists on the continent. They knew that the British art form was literature. They were never going to have a painter that equaled Shakespeare and Milton and all these other writers. That was their art. That was their tradition. And so what developed was an illustrational style of art in a literary tradition. The British absolutely loved anecdotal art. And what I mean by that is they loved these little illustrative scenes that it's like it's illustrating a novel, but there is no actual novel. It just seems to be illustrating a novel. And one of their favorite things to do with a painting like this is to look at every little detail and try and interpret what's going on or what it means. Now, you don't see this in French art or German art or anywhere else. It's uniquely British. In this case, it depicts references a poor teacher. They referred to these as conversation pieces because they were meant to be these sort of unstated commentaries on British society and culture. And you were supposed to look at them and then interpret these little things and then maybe debate what they might mean and have a conversation about it. That's why they were called conversation pieces. They were meant to start a dialogue on a social issue. And one of the biggest social issues was the plight of young women in Britain, particularly teachers and nannies who were basically teachers as well. There's a whole story here you can unravel. This is a young woman. She's mourning. She's in black. She's clearly recognizable as in mourning. She's reading a letter from home. She's a teacher because you see all her books here. She's lonely. Everything down here has meanings. We cannot interpret this in the way the British could. They could go through here and pick out 20 more things that I'm not going to see, but things that they recognize. This idea, and here's one by Redgrave. Richard Redgrave was famous for this theme. He actually had two sisters who both worked as nannies, so he was very sort of aware of it. Now, the sort of dialogue or the things you're supposed to really talk about and think about is these young women. These were typically middle class women. These were not working class women. Nannies were not looked down on the way a working class woman was. They were not necessarily sexualized, but they were young women who were in jeopardy. Typically, they'd only be doing this because, number one, they lost their father. They were almost all like orphaned. They needed to make money for the family. So, and they were also all well-educated young women. They're being hired not to babysit, but to really educate and raise these children. So they had to be educated young women. They were in an odd position in a home. They weren't family, but they also weren't servant. You know, they didn't fit downstairs, they don't fit upstairs. And they were also often young and they didn't have a protector. They didn't have that. I mean, they wouldn't be working there if they had the protector. If they had the father or the older brother, they wouldn't need to take the job. They didn't have the man somewhere protecting them. So they were vulnerable. And in the 19th century, you get this plethora of stories about these women. Jane Eyre is sort of the classic example, but you see it in British literature of the century everywhere about things that can happen to these women. And people were talking about it. It was an issue that needed to be discussed in Britain. So this is why we get all these stories about these young women. Rebecca Solomon, woman artist, obviously from the period, also did a lot of themes about women. She was really involved with a lot of organizations that were fighting for women's rights, eventually fighting for suffrage. She was one of 38 women that were petitioning the Royal Academy to open its doors to women. Women could not get into the Royal Academy in London any more than they could exhibit at the French Salon, but they couldn't get in as members of the French Academy either. So, you know, her viewpoint and her subjects are decidedly more feminist. In this case, she's speaking about, again, the governess here, and this is meant to be the daughter of the family, not the mother of the family, but the oldest child, the daughter, who's old enough to have her own suitors. So, you know, she's juxtapositioning the lives of these two women. This woman who, you know, is going to have a life and suitors and will have a family, and the young nanny who probably never will. They almost never ended up marrying, simply because, you know, they were removed from that world and they're too old. You know, they're working and basically this is their life. They're raising someone else's kids, and she shows that with the arm around the little boy. I mean, the nannies were more family usually than the actual blood family in most of these cases. So it's a juxtaposition of women's roles here. But the most important of these anecdotal paintings that deals with the life of women is Emily Osborne, Emily Osborne's painting, Nameless and Friendless. And her work, well, I don't seem to have notes on it, but it doesn't really matter. I don't need them. Her work, she was also part of the same circle. She was also involved with that petition and worked very hard for women's rights. And this is a really important statement about another young woman, and she doesn't take the path of being a nanny, but she is also orphaned. Her father is dead, so she's being forced to try and make some money for the family. And clearly she's already an artist, and she's brought some of her work to this picture dealer shop, and she's clearly very uncomfortable about it. This is not her world. The world of the city is not a world that's open to her, and a lot of these paintings deal with this idea of the city, and who's the city for, who's comfortable in the city, who can operate in the city, and who really can't. You know, clearly, he's sort of looking at it. This guy's looking down at it in a bit of disdain. This is her younger brother who's accompanying her now, carrying her portfolio. Just the fact that she has an escort, a male escort, is important. It may be a little boy, but at least she's not on her own. She wouldn't go there completely on her own. What's really interesting is these two guys over here who are looking at a print of a ballerina. And remember when we looked at Degas and talked about all of his ballet images, that I said those were sort of seen as semi-erotic images. Those young girls were being exploited. They were seen as being, mostly undressed in public, and they were sexualized. So as they're scanning through these images of ballerina, this is like looking through, pornography, and they're looking up and leering at her while they're looking at these scenes. They're sexualizing her. She may not be working class, but she's working. She's out in the city. This is worse than being a nanny. A nanny, at least, is in a private home, not going out in the city and selling your wares. And she's being sexualized at the time. So some people have said, and there's a sort of woman going out the door here with her son. This is a sort of matronly woman who's been in there to look at art, to buy art. So some people have said this shows like three different sort of roles of women in the city. You've got, the sort of what we're seeing as working class sexualized women's experiences, the respectable matronly woman who can go out and buy and shop. And then this woman who's selling, buying is one thing, selling is another, selling her wares in a very uncomfortable way. So this is very much a discussion piece for you to see all these little things and have this conversation about women artists and women in the city and all these changing roles of women. Really nice and very important painting. We don't really have a lot of time. I think let's stop there today. Sorry for the short class, but what we'll do next time is we'll take a look at the pre-Raphaelites. We'll take a look at the aesthetics movement, which is basically one person. We'll look at Whistler, who I mentioned briefly before, but he's a very important transitional figure. And then we'll look at Art Nouveau. And those three things I should be able to get done in 2 hours. Because quite frankly, Art Nouveau is not that complicated. It's not a complicated movement to talk about and to look at. It's a decorative arts movement. And I can give you a foundation of that pretty quickly. Does anybody have, I know this was a rush and hopefully we'll do better next time, but does anyone have questions or comments over anything at all that we talked about today? No. Oh, okay. Was that a question? Oh,
We talked about last week.
okay. We have a question about last week. Yes.
Oh, why do you think that Van Gogh never sold so many pictures except one or two or three?
Truthfully, I don't think he wanted to. I don't think he wanted the attention. He was down there working like crazy, but he wasn't out there trying to sell his work.
And they had lots of these. I went to the exhibit. He said that nobody buys my painting now, but someday they will recognize what.
Well, everybody says that who's not successful, right? Someday you're going to appreciate me. But he was right. One, I don't mean to be facetious about it, but one of the things we talk about in art that it takes to be a successful artist is something that goes way beyond the making of art. And this is true even today. It doesn't matter if you make great art. That doesn't mean you're going to be a successful artist. Doesn't mean you're going to sell your art. You have to know how to sell yourself.
His brother was a dealer.
You're right. He could have gone through his brother, but he chose not to. Remember when REA, that art critic, went down and interviewed him and wrote that article about him, and he got all upset about it. He was very disturbed, and he said, "Don't write about me again. Don't talk about me again." He wasn't comfortable interacting with people. This doesn't explain why he couldn't have given his work to his brother and had him sell it for him. So you're right, he could have done that, and he might have been more successful if he had done that. I think somewhere deep inside he was he would have been happy if his work sold, but he almost would have been happy if like his name weren't on it or something. I can understand. There's something about it that I understand, that you don't want the spotlight on you. I mean, he was autistic, and he couldn't communicate, and he didn't really want. So part of him wanted to sell it, part of him didn't. And the piece he sold was in an exhibition. It wasn't like with a dealer that was trying to sell it. He just, somebody saw it and approached him and bought it. But that's a good question, because he could have taken that other route. And I don't, we may never know exactly why.
I think sometimes just the idea of monetizing something like a piece of art is
Wait a
troubling.
minute, I got two people talking to me at the same time, and I can't listen. Somebody on here. First, let me, I don't think he cared about monetizing. He'd have been happy for the money. He needed the money desperately, and I don't think he believed his work couldn't be monetized. So I don't think that was it. I think honestly, I think it was just more, he did want to, and he didn't want to, kind of
Yeah,
all
yeah.
at the same time. He just wanted to be left alone to make the art. Yeah, what were you saying?
Well, if you go to see, you're gonna be really mad, because every time that they described a picture that was shown, it was mostly before you got into it, so all the- everything that they made a comment about was, I don't think whoever did this knew anything.
Are you talking about that big?
Yeah, the big, and they all, every single painting they talked about, they related to his mental state. He was either really crazy when he did this, or he wasn't very crazy when he did this. It was really jarring.
I knew the minute I saw that first advertised that they didn't know anything about his work, because you wouldn't even think of creating something like this. If that's not how you look, that's not his art. That's a huge oversized projection of a painting. That's not what he made. You're not going to see more of his art by making it bigger. You're going to see it by going and looking at it, but not by making it bigger. So you made me feel better. Thank you. Because I suspected.
Well, they did do a few clever things, the flowering tree that is so beautiful.
Oh,
I don't
yeah.
know why that didn't sell. Somebody would have bought that. Well, superimposed on that was a lot of blowing blossoms like the wind before.
Oh, superimpose. Yeah, that's a good way to look at art, is superimpose something over it.
There was a little train that's in one of his pictures that I never seen, and it was going.
Yeah, I was determined not to go see that. Yeah.
The stuff that you just showed, the pictures you just showed of women in their position in
Right.
society. The purpose of that was I'm questioning the purpose of all of this art showing women in these lonely and blah, blah, blah. Was that to reflect the position of women, or was that to keep the position? Was that like a propaganda campaign to keep?
Well, that's a really good question, actually, because you could read it either way. It was to get you talking about it first and foremost. But in the specific examples we looked at, they were sympathetic. They weren't trying to say this is where women should be, because they were far too sentimental. They were far too obviously, this is not a good thing, they're too obvious. And the ones made by women obviously were feminists,
Right.
and the other guy, his two sisters were. But there is plenty of art that has been made to validate social injustice, just as much art as there has been to challenge it. Even in British art, even in the 19th century, there's plenty of that, especially in the 18th century. Gainsborough, for example, was notorious for his portraits of the aristocracy on the landed gentry, and presenting them on their land in a way that seemed to validate the rightness of their superior position. That's what they wanted. That's what they were paying him for. And he was really good at that. So, art can do either. It can challenge and question, which is a new thing, actually. Traditionally, art doesn't question, art validates the status quo. That's been its role throughout history. It's a new thing. That's why realism was so controversial. It's why Courbet gets in trouble for showing these laboring working class. He's questioning and challenging for the first time. You weren't supposed to do that in art. So it is a modern thing to begin to question and challenge. But in this particular case, they were clearly, yeah. They were very, let's think about this, guys. This is what's going on. Let's think about these women. I'm not telling you what to do about it, but think about it.
Wasn't there a feminist movement more or less in the 1890s?
Yes, definitely there were. And these women in London were really part of it. They were some of the first trying to get admitted into the schools. Of course, the suffrage movement is late part of the century. It's sort of the same people. I mean, that's why the symbolists were what they were, because, women were getting uppity, right? So suddenly all these femme fatales pop out of their subconscious. We talked about that. It's where Freud comes from. Would Freud exist if women weren't starting to make these gains? Probably not. He's writing in the 90s too, and he's starting to see all of these, Freud's exactly referencing the same ideas. So yeah, absolutely they were. Any other questions or comments? Well, then I'll see you next week. That will be our last class, and I'll try and cull it down so we can get everything that we need. I will remember to have everything with me. Bye, everybody.
Discussion.